Welcome to College Recruiter. Today we are going to be discussing employee engagement, particularly of entry level, and we'll be touching on how to measure engagement, what it means, some organizations who are doing this well, who should be accountable for employee engagement, and other tips. So today, I'm Anna Peters, and I am joined by two members of our panel of experts, Janine Truitt, who is the Chief Innovations Officer at Talene Think Innovations. Welcome, Janine.
Thank you for having me.
And Alexandra Levit, who is an author, speaker, and consultant of business and workplace. So thank you for joining us as well, Alex.
You're welcome. Great to be here.
So let's get started. Just to dive in, what are some of the resources or research that you two can point to very briefly to just set the tone that this is worth looking at?
Well, I definitely look at Gallup in terms of the statistics for the number of employees not engaged, engaged, and disengaged, which are three different things. Gallup measures this several times a year, so I tend to keep my fingers on the pulse of that. I also look at Deloitte surveys that come out, McKinsey. Silk Road is a partner that I work with that looks at this issue as well. And so between all of those resources, I definitely feel like I have a sense of what it looks like from mostly from the U.S. perspective. And I sometimes will get contradictory information, but usually it will paint a picture that may not necessarily be wonderful. For example, the latest Gallup poll I saw said that 75% of employees are currently not engaged at work. That doesn't mean they're disengaged, but it doesn't mean they're super engaged either. So that's not a great number. These numbers haven't been great for the last couple of years, and I'm curious as to what Janine has to say on this one as well, what she looks at.
Yeah, so I'm on the safe wavelength with Alexandra. I look at the State of the American Workforce report that comes out annually through Gallup. And like she said, they monitor that throughout the year. So I monitor that as well. I love Burson and Deloitte as well for their metrics. I also look at the Corporate Executive Board, but I think they've now shortened to CEB. They put out a lot of good reports and surveys around employee engagement and what C-suite leaders are looking at from year to year, what they're thinking about things. So I think those are good. I think another place that I'm kind of drawing my, information from too is because I do a lot of workshops. And so when I do workshops, just speaking to attendees or hearing what they have to say, especially during team building exercises about, reasons why they may be engaged or disengaged, that you can't get any more raw than that. Yeah. So I also draw from that as well.
It's interesting how that varies in different companies, right? And in different age groups and in different functions within different companies. One more resource that I really love is Bob Kelleher has a book called I Engage, which I think it's now about a year old. It's pretty recent, but he has a lot to say on the topic. He's kind of like a known expert on this topic and has some kind of forward-thinking ideas that people might want to check out.
Good research. So very briefly, when we talk about engagement, we're not saying that everyone needs to be walking around the office smiling and socializing and, seemingly joyous. Can you give your definition of what engagement is? So what you should be measuring, essentially.
So for me, I look at it as the employee being satisfied and invested in the company and or their work. I mean, to put it very simply, a lot of times we make the mistake of thinking that it's a happiness measure or, a social measure. And many times than not, we've been wrong because we're not looking at the myriad of people that are in the workforce. So for instance, there are some people who are just typically not happy-go-lucky people, and that's just how they are. And so as a manager, you can be making a grave mistake by thinking you should have a conversation with them based on what their disposition is. In that they may turn around and tell you, I'm perfectly fine. I'm just not having the greatest day, or I'm just not that person, right? Yeah. So that we try to get away from that talk, although it helps. If somebody is happy at work and socializing, that's usually a good indication that they may be satisfied. But I think at a very basic level, We're looking for the employees to be satisfied in the work that they're doing, where they're doing it, and also to be invested in it. And that's basically what engagement is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all wonderful points, Janine. And I would just piggyback on that a little bit by saying that what we traditionally think of as an engagement isn't really everything. I mean, historically, engagement does drive, if you look at the studies around this, it drives innovation, it does drive growth, revenue, and what we tend to think of as other key markers of organizational success. And we've seen that organizations will manage to hire top talent, but somehow that talent will disengage from their jobs, from the culture, from mission and values. And when that happens, productivity plunges, customer satisfaction plunges. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that sometimes disengagement is actually out of the organization's control. And Janine kind of alluded to this a little bit. Engagement can ebb and flow depending on something that's totally not work related. It could be something that's going on in an employee's personal life. And if that's the case, they can still be activated to get the job done. And this notion of talent activation is one that I've heard around a little bit. I first heard it when I worked with an organization that does HR software called Silk Road. And they referred it to talent activation is someone who is really motivated to do their job and do the best they can and leverage the resources they need to be successful, but they might not be what we traditionally look at as engaged. And I think that goes along with what Janine was saying. Like sometimes you don't have the personality to be engaged, but yet you can still be engaged from a work perspective. And I think those nuances are kind of important to keep in mind when we look at this issue, particularly as it gets more and more sophisticated. I think now we've been looking at employee engagement for the better part of a decade, and we're starting to see little tweaks in terms of what we mean by engagement and how we proceed with making sure we foster it among our populations of employees.
So to piggyback off of that, what matters, what should employers be measuring? If it's not necessarily the happy-go-lucky personality, what should employers zone in on, and how often should they measure that? You know, are we talking about surveys every 2 years? It seems like that's almost outdated. That standard 2-year survey is, but so many employers follow that, right? Like the biennial, and right. You know, we laugh because we know it should be more often than that. So how often should be employers giving out surveys, and how else can they be measuring?
So I think that we focus a lot on surveys, almost too much. So, I mean, surveys is obviously one way in which you can be getting some information on how engaged your workforce is. Mm-hmm. But, you know, foreseeably, you're doing this regularly, right? Like, you're not going to wait a year or even 6 months. Mm-hmm. There's so many points of engagement between the employee and the people that they report to that I'd almost think it'd be happening in meetings, you know, just taking pulses as a manager, taking a pulse of sentiments that are shared. That's a way of understanding who's engaged and who's not, who's speaking up, who's not, you know, who's alluding to some issues that maybe haven't cropped up before, who's saying certain things in one-on-one meetings that you're having, presumably if you're having those like weekly or bi-weekly. I mean, all of these things are data points. And then you add on top of that the layers of pulse surveys and the annual, just in general surveys, and obviously exit interviews, which is far too late, but still, you know, like all of that stuff becomes data. The performance evaluations, if you have your employee do performance rebuttals, what are they saying? You know, all too often these pieces of information for a lot of companies is still very siloed, unfortunately. And so we tend to look at it as separate entities onto itself. And I guess it warrants that sort of treatment on some level. But I'm really trying to move companies towards looking at it holistically and having correct and having it, looking at it on a continuum and making some judgment calls about what that story tells. I mean, that's essentially what the whole big data conversation's about, but this is where we start to use it in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, especially with respect to what Janine said, it's a continuum of experiences. I think this notion of employee experience, we've been hearing it a lot. It's a buzz phrase within the HR and talent management community, this notion of employee experience. But really being able to understand that engagement, to be successful at it and to measure it, you have to look at it as a series of experiences that take place throughout the entire employee life cycle, from being a candidate who's recruited to someone who's a new employee being onboarded, to learning and development, to having your performance measured and monitored. And even when, as Janine said, you're being offboarded or you're giving an exit interview. And I think we have to have a series of touch points during each of those experiences where we connect employees to organizational goals. We're asking them how they feel they have performed related to those organizational goals and how their individual goals are mapping to organizational goals and how they feel about that. I mean, I think an important aspect of employee experience is not just what did you do, but how did it make you feel when you were doing it? Did you feel like you were a part of the organization? Did you feel like you were connected to the big picture? And I think that if you are looking at those things over the entire trajectory of an employee's tenure with an organization, you'll find that you don't need to have these annual or semi-annual surveys, that it will naturally be happening as you move to more agile performance management and agile management of employees in general.
Yeah. I like that idea of a map of touch points, almost as an employer might create for their customers. What are the touch points that you have for your customers and how do you manage their experience? I like that. So why don't we end our part one, because we have a part two coming, and we'll touch on some accountability, hopefully weave in a little bit more about entry level particularly. So stay with us, and thank you for joining.
You're welcome. See you soon.
All right.
Thank you.